Good evening. Sometimes it seems like we could just let you keep talking and we'd accomplish the same thing, but I think that would be a discourtesy to our brilliant lecturer tonight. I'm Jana Staten, and on behalf of the Western Montana Spiritual Development Council, I would like to welcome everyone here to this fifth in our series of talks on global climate change. I'd like to explain that after the talk, we'll have a time for table conversations. We should have somebody at each table willing to facilitate. So look around for someone with a badge, and I'll try to make sure that there's someone at each table, and then we'll have a time for questions and feedback to the speaker. I would also like to say that at the end of this series, we're holding a workshop on Saturday morning this week, November 10th at Holy Family, John the 23rd. It's an open workshop for anyone in the community. There are registrations on the table. We would really like you to sign up tonight. Even if you can't pay, it's $10 for a single, $15 for couples, $5 if you're living lightly. But we'd like to know who's coming, so we'll have tables set up for you. It'll be a format like this, and we'll have a 3-hour workshop on what we can do as individuals and especially as congregations in Missoula to address the challenge of climate change in our own community. And so we'd welcome all of you. We have about 40 people possibly coming, and we'd like 60. So if there's 20 more people in the room, that would be great. Dane Scott will now introduce our speaker for the evening.
Well, thank you very much for coming out. This has been a real pleasure for the Center for Ethics to cooperate with Lutheran Campus Ministries and the Western Montana Spiritual Development Council. This has been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed coming out these evenings. And it's really fitting to have the final lecture in the series before the workshop offered by Albert Boardman, who's a very generous person for every time I ask Albert, he's very willing. And he's a wonderful resource for a Center for Ethics to have. Albert's unique as a philosopher. A really high compliment was paid to Albert this summer by a friend of mine, Paul Thompson, who's another eminent philosopher. And he said, Albert's probably the only philosopher he knows that really has a readership and a following in his own community. And I think I think that's a real compliment, that he's an educator and person that people turn out because he has something to say. And so we welcome Albert Boardman.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here to talk about global warming as a spiritual crisis. To understand global warming as a spiritual crisis, we have to begin with make a distinction between a catastrophe and a crisis. In a catastrophe, bad things happen, and all you can do is be brave about it. In a crisis, bad things happen, but there's a glimmer of hope. You may be able to do good things and bring the crisis to a good conclusion. Global warming definitely constitutes a crisis. Is it a spiritual crisis? Yes, it is, but it's difficult to understand just how it is, and the question is often, I think, misplaced and given a misleading and unhelpful answer. A lot of people who are proponents and advocates of spirituality reason as follows. Global warming is a crisis. Bad things are happening. And the only solution can be and has to be a spiritual solution, because it's a spiritual crisis. And I think that answer is mistaken and unhelpful. And the reason is this. The global crisis of warming may have a solution that does not require spirituality. And to think so is in a way self-serving and risky. It's part of a larger pattern that's often called the God of the gaps position, where religious people say to the culture at large, you've got a problem, and only God and spirituality can solve that problem. Say hunger or disease. And sure enough, people who have no spirituality whatsoever, work towards the solution to hunger and to the cure of diseases. And then the gap shrinks. There's still something left where only spirituality helps. But the danger is that the gap finally closes and there's no longer any need for God. Religion becomes irrelevant. And the reason is that we shouldn't think of spirituality as a solution of that sort. Now, to locate the spiritual character of global warming as a crisis, we have to distinguish the spiritual crisis from two other ways in which global warming constitutes a crisis. It's a massive crisis and it's a moral crisis. And finally, a spiritual crisis. So how do these crises hang together? Global warming is a massive crisis in the sense that it creates and constitutes a massive danger to human well-being. It aggravates all the environmental crises we've had before: population explosion, resource depletion, and it narrows the space of solutions. Global warming makes it impossible to sort of work our way out of the crisis through more and more technology. There's, so to speak, a lid on what we can do. It's as though there's a gas and the space for the gas is being constricted. The molecules collide, things heat up, and clearly there's a possibility of tension and war, and perhaps even to human survival. But the technological way of life that has given rise to the crisis of global warming has faced crises before. The population crisis, the resource crisis. And there have been, and the dire predictions that have been made about, the overburdening of the planet and the resource depletion just have not come to pass. Technologists usually found a way to get out of the crises through some sort of technology. And so it is again conceivable, if not likely, that we will get out of the crisis of global warming by technological means. The cost will be high to the poor and to the powerless and to the environment, but at length, some kind of sustainability and equilibrium with resources may be attained. That's conceivable because even now, somewhere between 25,000 and 50,000 people a day die of preventable causes. So, if 100,000 people die, will people know? Will people care? If it's 500,000, will they know? Will they care? And as far as the environment is concerned, you hear voices already that say, let's cope with it. There's no need to slow it or to stop it. Let's just cope by technological means with whatever environmental consequences global warming will have. So there is a possible solution to the massive side of the crisis, but it will be at the expense of social justice, and it will be at the expense of the environment. So therefore, it does constitute, even if successful on the massive scale, a moral crisis. It's a crisis that will bring about moral costs as far as global justice and respect for the environment is concerned that are not acceptable. So does that moral crisis constitute a spiritual crisis? It does, if only spiritually oriented people are capable and have shown to be capable to take on the problem of social justice and of the environment. And is that the case? And I don't think it is the case. There are atheists, there are secular people like Peter Singer, or Daniel Dennett, who clearly fight for social justice. There are secular institutions such as the ACLU, the United Nations, Marxists who fight for social justice. So it's definitely not the privilege of spiritual people. And as far as the environment is concerned, the churches for sure arrived at the scene, breathless and a little late. The Sierra Club was there long before Defenders of Wildlife, the Wilderness Society, and all kinds of organizations. So, again, even as a moral crisis, it's not necessarily a spiritual crisis. And although we should welcome and support the efforts of all the people who fight for social justice and for the environment, we should recognize that these efforts are, in an important sense, incomplete. The incompleteness comes to the fore when you imagine that these efforts succeed, that there is equality and, at the very least, environmental sustainability. So imagine there is equality. Everybody on the globe has what we have. And there is environmental sustainability. Things can go on forever and ever. But it's incomplete in the sense that precisely at that point, the question would become urgent, if it is not urgent already: equality, what of? And what does the environment environ? What is at the center of it? What is being sustained by environmental sustainability? Well, it's the kind of life that those people who are well-to-do in this society lead. And what sort of a life is that? It's largely a life of indifference and ignorance. Indifference about social justice and the environment, ignorance about what's going out in the world at large. And I think here we begin to touch on the spiritual crisis. How did it come about that people who have the means to care and to act on their care, who have the means to inform themselves, are as ignorant and as indifferent as they are in fact? And this is not just the belly aching of some professor who would like others to be more like him. That's just the fact of of social science. By all standards of excellence in culture and ethics, we are condemned by our possibilities. We live at a level that is inexcusably low. And why is that? Well, it came about through an event that inaugurated the modern era and that Max Weber famously called the disenchantment of the world, a dispiriting of the world. Prior to the modern period, the world, in its various cultures, was a spiritual plenum. What's a plenum? It's something that's filled without gaps. And it was filled without gaps with spirits. And at the place where we are right now, where you sit, where I stand, that world existed 200 years ago, right here in the Native American culture. Everything was full of spirits. The sky, the stars, the animals, the water, the earth. But beginning in Central and Southern Europe, the disenchantment began. And here again, it's important to understand what that means. It's not altogether a bad thing, because they're evil spirits. The spirit of hunger, the spirit of disease, the spirit of prejudice. And it was a good thing to think of hunger not as an evil spirit or caused by an evil spirit, but as a problem that we can solve and that allows us to feed people, to heal them. So that that kind of dispiriting was a good thing. And also, the dispiriting of leaving behind the spirit of home and place is at least plausibly a good thing. It's certainly not a bad thing to pull up your stakes, to move away, and to make your fortune in the new world. But the disenchantment and the dispiriting, I think, becomes dubious and injurious when we become deaf to the spirit of the sacred. And the disenchantment has, so to speak, muted the voices of the sacred. And what's the sacred? The sacred is something other and greater than ourselves that can grace and redeem our lives. And the sacred in that sense is what we have become deaf to, and that's the spiritual crisis. The sacred, in the way in which I've defined it, constitutes an obligation, and it constitutes a source of strength. It constitutes an obligation, the obligation to hold the welfare of the least and last person sacred. The obligation to think of the environment as something that we should hold sacred. And I think the line, a fuzzy and blurry line to be sure, that separates those people who hold something sacred and those for whom nothing is sacred, is the crucial line today. More important, I think, than the line between the religious and the non-religious people, for instance. Now, the sacred as an obligation, of course, is burdensome. And we all know that we need a source of strength to be able to meet that obligation. And where do we find the sacred as a source of strength? Where do we hear that voice? That voice is not in the wind of Katrina. It's not in the fire of San Diego. It's not in the earthquake in Indonesia. It's the still, small voice that we hear in art, in sport, and out in nature. It's the voice that we hear when someone plays a piece by Bach for unaccompanied cello in the music recital hall. It's the voice that becomes audible when someone runs 50 miles across the Elkhorn Mountains, or when a group of people sit by a campfire in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. And in all those cases, there's an intimacy with something that we encounter, find to be beyond our control, and at the same time that engages us so fully that we feel graced and that we feel the possibility of redemption. But, of course, not all of us can play the cello or even strum a guitar. Not all of us can run 50 miles or even 5 miles. And not all of us are capable to hike into the wilderness and set up a camp. But all of us have to eat every day. And it is at the dinner table where the grace and the redemption that can serve as a source of strength comes to be present to us. And it is in drawing from that strength that we can hope to meet these large obligations of social justice and global social justice and of the environment. You may ask, finally, well, what's the contribution that spiritual people make to the global crisis of climate change and warming. After all, atheists, secular people are doing just as well. And so what's uniquely spiritual about the good that we, if we're spiritually oriented people, can hope to bring to the global crisis of climate change? And here we have to remember what Tertullian said in the 2nd or 3rd century before the Common Era. Tertullian was an early theologian and chronicler of Christianity, an observer of Christianity, heretical, late in life, but very observant and a coiner of fine phrases. And he said about what drew the attention of the pagans at that time to the Christians. And he said, the pagans say, so he reports, look how they love one another, and look how they're willing to give their lives for one another. And so the challenge for spiritual people and for religious people in particular, and for the Christians among us, is this: to draw on the grace that comes from the breaking of the bread, both at the dinner table and at the Eucharist, in a way that makes non-Christians say, look how they love what is sacred and how they're willing to give their lives to it. Thank you. So, conversations are next, I think. Or questions? I don't know what the format.
Sure. We'll have Steve come up and
Yeah.
have a few remarks, and then we'll have a chance for. Oh, let me use the microphone. Albert, thank you very much. First of all, it's wonderful to hear your words and your challenge to all of us. Part of our format is to have some first thoughts, remarks, and maybe a couple of questions from one of the area clergy. We call on Steve Orestovich, the chaplain at Holy Spirit Episcopal, where Albert is also a member. And then afterwards, we'll break into some small group discussions at each of our tables, and allowing time then for us to ask questions back and forth at the end. So, Steve, come on up.
I wanted to be first, not after Albert. The marvelous thing about Albert is you can see him in the bookstore or you can see him at a Lyle Lovett concert. It's all part of the sacred, no matter where you go. I took notes, as you did. I took notes like mad. And again, Albert always leaves us with more questions. Always wants us to plumb a little deeper than where we're comfortable. And of course, my notes are all about questions. The first is, will and can spiritual people take on the global warming crisis? Are we too indifferent? Are we truly ignorant? Are we just satisfied with where we are? Second question, how did it come about that people who have the wherewithal to make a change don't do it? Disenchantment with the world. I think this is a period of time when we are once again deeply disenchanted. Albert talked about disease, hunger, prejudice. It seems to me that it's as those three ills are as present to us today as they've been at any other time in human history, but in different forms and different fashions. Do we have the wherewithal to change it? Are we too indifferent? Are we too ignorant? David Tracy Ellis wrote a book 25 years ago called The Blessed Rage for Sacred Order. And in it he said religion has failed because it has shut down its symbol factory. We no longer have symbolic language or images that lead us to the sacred. That we are so caught up in the business of technology, that we are so caught up in facts, that we lose that ability to see poetry, to see the divine under all other things. I think he was probably painfully right, and I think that's some of what Albert had to say. We don't see the sacred in the world around us. Where do we find the sacred? My notes say Albert said art, sport, nature. And in this marvelous book, Power, Failure, subtitled Christianity and the Culture of Technology, Albert makes a great case for eating together, for breaking bread together in many different contexts, for shutting the television off and reading, and for walking together. Small, simple things. In fact, I think in the last two books you used Missoula as indicative of a community that could make that happen. Were that it were more true than it even is. A couple questions for Albert, then I don't have to talk and Albert does. In our American collective consciousness, do you see any positive thing, any positive trait, historically or present, that would cause us to believe that as a people we really can get together, think together, and make a change? That would be the first. And the second is you talk about celebration in your book, Power and Failure. What do you mean about those two things? Would you answer those?
Well, there are many and scattered phenomena and movements that give us hope. And the devotion to the arts, things like right here, out to lunch on Wednesdays, on the Wednesdays of summer, the farmers market, the communities of runners, of skiers, of musicians. That's, I think, where grace happens. And there are many more. There are things like the slow food movement, the turn off TV movement. The problem is that they're scattered and don't know of one another. And I think that in some senses, this country may be best positioned to break through the blandishments of technology that make us so indifferent and ignorant. It's perhaps like a disease that you have to pass through, that you cannot avoid. And in many ways, this is, technologically speaking, the oldest of the siblings in the family of nations. We're always the first to have an automotive culture, the first to have a radio culture, a television culture, an internet culture, and who knows, a genetically modified culture. And the other countries are the first to have a problem with overweight and obesity and so on. And so perhaps we'll break through as well. And I'm hopeful that we will. Celebration, I think, has to be at the center of life. It's the counterpart to consumption. Consumption, I think, is not self-sustaining. It requires ever new incitements and spices and a higher degree of this, a higher degree of that, and you always come away disappointed. It's a lot like addiction. You know, you get this high and then you have this disappointment and the desire rises again. And that's now well documented, I think, by social science, that's the nature of consumption. Celebration is the encounter, the collective encounter, the communal encounter with some great thing that is greater than any one of us, and even greater than all of us merely as human beings. And so if you take the farmer's market, it's the fertility of this valley, the cycle of the seasons that we celebrate there. And it joins us in a way in which nothing else in this valley is able to join us. And when you leave the farmer's market, you don't feel the way that you feel after 3 hours of television, an empty bag of potato chips, and an empty six-pack. You feel like And you think, never again, why could I do such a stupid thing? But then you do it again. When you leave the farmer's market, you're glad, and it's a gladness that sort of you carry with you into the day. And so a celebration is when things are good, when life is good, when we can affirm who we are, where we are. And so rather than always investing our hopes in consumption and more consumption, we should remember celebration and make sure that it is at the center of our lives and has an assured and regular position in our lives. Let's see. What's next?
Let's go ahead and allow some time for each of the tables to have some discussion around the topics that have been raised, the questions that have been raised. 15, 20 minutes, we'll come back and then have each table a chance to respond and ask questions accordingly. So there should be someone who will be a moderator at your table to make sure that everybody gets a chance to speak and to be heard. And let's have that time of conversation. Let's go ahead and bring our group back together. This has spurred so much conversation. We certainly can't nail it down in 10, 20 minutes, 25, 30 minutes, but we want to give each of the groups a chance to respond, to perhaps ask a question or make a comment, and have Albert the chance to answer as well. And so we'll just go around and we'll have a spokesperson from each table stand up, please, and speak as loud as you can. Who'd like to go? Go ahead.
It began with a distinction between a catastrophe and crisis. Crisis can be resolved. And then you offered three responses to the crisis: technological, moral, and spiritual. We thought we heard you say that there can be a technological response to the crisis, absent the moral and spiritual. So our first question is, are you saying that absent the moral and spiritual, is the technological response is adequate to the crisis? Or are you suggesting that without the moral and spiritual dimensions, there will be no adequate response?
A technological solution is possible. And I call this the unwarranted optimism of the pessimists. So the pessimists say, look, things are going down the drain. It's just hopeless unless they come to us, the spiritual people. So they're optimistic that they don't have to make a moral argument for a better life. All they have to do is sort of sit back and wait for everybody to come to you and say, we're out of solutions, help us. And that doesn't have to happen. And there's a great danger that it will not happen. There will be a technological solution at great moral costs. But moral costs haven't sort of deterred us. You know, I mean, if you tell people, do this or you're going to die, they'll say, oops, what is it I should do? But if you tell people, don't do this, you're going to be a morally objectionable person, they'll say, that's fine, as long as I can have my car. And there's a great danger that the rich nations, and within the rich nations, the upper middle class, sort of retreat to some safe haven. They all move a little further north. They get more air conditioning. But the people in Bangladesh, they're going to drown or be displaced by the millions. They die of diseases because they're displaced. And, you know, and the temperature is going to rise, but we'll cope with that. So we can't sit back as spiritual people and say, look, you people out there, there's no solution unless they come to us. They're not going to come to us. We have to make the moral case. And the moral case, of course, is not massive. It's subtle. It's difficult to make. But it can be made if we think of ourselves as not scolds and righteous, self-righteous people, but as bearers of good news, where we say, look, there's a better way of life. And once you recognize it, you can let go of a lot of things that deprive other people around the globe and that are just terrible on the environment.
Our talk focused a lot around collaboration, and where do you think groups like social groups, environmental groups, and political groups could find common ground in collaboration? Is that maybe a spiritual thing that they could find, or where would you suggest they look to find that collaborating point?
Well, it often seems to me that that a lot of work needs to be done to point out to special interest groups that they have a general interest that connects them. For instance, that the Sierra Club and the Slow Food people are really after the same thing. The people who want a bicycle culture are after the same thing. And that they're weak because they're so scattered and don't know of one another. So there should be a way needs to be found for these people to connect and to see that what they want is a saner and more restful and real way of life. So I think philosophers have a task here to provide the language that people can sort of see what that is and can talk about it in a way that's understandable. But finally, I think it's got to be electoral politics, right? I mean, that's how it's going to happen. And movement politics is great, but if it doesn't translate into electoral politics, that's not going to matter. And that's going to be the difficult part. You'll finally have to say, we're going to support so-and-so, because so-and-so is going to do the right thing, and that person is not going to do it. And for better or worse, if you ask, which is the party that pays more attention to social justice and the environment? Well, I won't answer that question.
Who's next?
Our people covered a great deal of ground, ending up with the immorality of the present war. And so I'm not sure that we were able to focus time on it. But one of our concerns, and I think you addressed it, and that is that there may be solutions to some of the problems we have, but they will come at a sacrifice to a lot of people. And you can build a green house now, but it costs you $500,000. Somebody gets left out of that equation. Somebody will suffer. And I think part of the spiritual and moral question that we had is, how do we make sure that doesn't happen to those folks? I mean, that in fact, the rising water raises all of the boats, and that in fact, we don't have even a greater disparity between the haves and the have-nots as we try to move to a greener world.
Yes, I think it's been remarked by a lot of people that some of the green movements that are sort of chic and seem to be enlightened are really fake. And so building a greenhouse, that costs $500,000 and has, I don't know, 5,000 square feet or 10,000 square feet. It doesn't matter how green it is. That's just not responsible. It's just not acceptable. All of us have to do less. It's got to be less. So I heard someone on BBC a few days ago, and the person said, it's fine to fly, but you just got to pay for the cost of your environmental impact. So every ticket should be, 25% more, and then that sum would be used, I don't know what for. And, well, we have to do less. You can't do the same thing and then, think that somehow that's compensated for. So, I don't think that there is an environmental or green policy that is compatible with the same level of consumption, only more sophisticated. There has to be less. Otherwise, it's socially, from the point of view of social justice, unacceptable.
Albert, your topic is filled with challenges. We have two questions, I think, right? Right? How do you define the sacred? And for example, does it include hurricanes? Plato said we're all born with a fire within us, and spirituality is what we do with that fire. So everybody is spiritual in some way. Either they choose to be violent or non-violent, compassionate or non-compassionate, stewards or not stewards. So the second question, how can we take and awaken the spirituality of all of us to direct our fire to do something about this?
I think that fire can go out, and it has gone out in a lot of people. And again, to think, and I get this from my theologically astute and well-trained brother-in-law, who says that human beings have sort of an irrepressible desire for the transcendent. And therefore, and that desire can only be fulfilled by Christianity. Well, that desire can die. It can, at the very least, it can go dormant. And it has done so, I think, to a really disquieting degree. And so you can't just count on it. You have to reawaken it. And I'm afraid that it's not going to be reawakened by itself. So all who see that sort of slumber and have somehow been graced, it's not their personal accomplishment that they see it. They have a responsibility, and they need to reawaken it. And how do you do that? Well, it's things like this. It's the churches, it's education, it's the media, it's political work, and but it's a hard task.
We sort of came to consensus around the notion that we need to reevaluate our value system. And maybe one way of doing that would be to have more interaction between generations. For instance, rather than, as we've come to live in the nuclear family, where there's little to no interaction between generations, if we had a way of being in the old-fashioned extended family where the young could take the wisdom or the experiences of the elderly who are going to burn out, maybe, and the young have the courage and the curiosity and the energy to take forward and not waste the elderly experience. We wonder if there is any possibility of a restructuring of society that would allow something like this to take place.
Well, as an unwilling but nonetheless enrolled member of AARP, let me say this about that. Yes. So what's the problem here? The sentiment with which I wholly agree will fail if it's done in the teeth of the physical and social arrangements that we now have, and especially the physical arrangements. So take, let me give you two examples. One is condominiums in New York City. These people don't know of one another. And why is that? Because there's no need for them, and of course, they don't want to bother. And the building, of course, is constructed in such a way that it's almost impossible to get to know who lives with you, young people, older people, whatever. So you have to reconstruct these buildings so that they have at least a chance that it's inviting for them to run into one another in places other than the elevator. So what would that be? Well, the building would have to have some common spaces that are inviting. You know, where you're gonna have a cup of coffee, read the paper. There would have to be staircases that are inviting so that, you know, if you live on the 23rd floor, you may not want to take all the stairs that get you there. But, you know, it would be a good thing if you did some walking. So if you could take the elevator, say, to the 20th, and then there's a wonderful staircase that just invites you to go out to the 23rd floor, and perhaps, you know, at the 20th floor there is a space where people are sitting, then that sort of interchange can take place. To give you another example, we think of the internet as a great research resource, right? And what it does is it prevents me, or at least that's the thing, these things are so subtly conducive that you hardly know what's happening. But when I need a book, I either try to find the text on the internet, or if I really need the book, I go to Amazon.com and click on it, and if I need it badly, you know, I have it delivered in a day. What is it that I don't do? I don't walk across campus where I see people, run into people, have conversations with people. I don't talk to a librarian when there's something that I don't quite know, and I say, where would I find this? So all that social interaction has been cut out by what we think of as this great information convenience, which is the internet. So we have to recognize these tendencies and work actively against them. And just to say, you know, there needs to be more interaction between the old and the young, that alone is not enough. We have to rearrange the material environment in such a way that this is an inviting thing to do, if not a necessary thing. Yeah.
Could you define the difference between a moral crisis and a spiritual crisis? And also, we wanted to know about what concrete steps can you take to combat consumerism?
A moral crisis is the violation of moral standards that, at least in broad daylight, we all agree on. And they're equality, human dignity, and self-determination. And there is no one of consequence who says, down with dignity or down with equality. And if these are violated, then we have a moral crisis. However, these moral standards, which are crucial and non-negotiable, at least strategically, though tactically you may have to do some maneuvering, are necessary conditions for the good life and not sufficient conditions. Because you can't have equality of mindlessness, equality of overweight, equality of cheap beer, and irresistible potato chips. And so more is needed. And when that additional thing, the more nearly sufficient conditions of the good life, are missing and ignored, as they are just standardly in our society, then you have a spiritual crisis. And as you know, the moral crisis just sort of gets talked about by Edwards, right? Bless his heart, he's not going to win. And but the spiritual crisis, well, at least telling asides in the books that Barack Obama has written, bless his heart, he's going to win. But he's not talking a lot about them, and that's fine. I'm digressing, but the first virtue of a politician is to get elected, right? And, of course not at any price, but so what can we do against consumerism? Well, it's what I've called being a bearer of good news, right? And then politically, we just have to do things that are very important, but almost invisible to the everyday person, right? So a farm bill has just been passed, and the farm bill supports, at great expense, commodities, namely corn, soybeans, wheat and rice, I think those are the ones. And corn in particular is turned into ethanol, but also high fructose syrup. And what does high fructose syrup do? It makes your Coke that much more irresistible, and your hamburgers, and a lot of other things, right? That's the very thing we need the least. But, has there been an outcry? Have people, written to their senators? Even John Tester, whom, Nancy did a lot to put into office, bless her and his heart, and some other people, he's praising the farm bill. And of course it has some good things, and again, I don't want John Tester just to throw his next election by saying things that are excessively bold. Nonetheless, the overweight and obesity that began in the 70s really has a reason, and it's farm policy, which makes a certain kind of very hard to resist food very cheap. So we have to work at both levels, sort of at the ground level of persuading people that there's a better way of life, at the political level by stopping these policies that are just ruinous to people's physical and others to their intellectual well-being.
You mentioned about the Native Americans, and perhaps this could be extended to indigenous people who seem to have more of a sense of the spirit world. Is it necessary for us to connect with our spirituality in order, if we are going to reconnect with our spirituality, do we need to also then become more aware of what is the spirit world in which we move? I mean, is this will this change our relationship to our environment if we have a greater sense of the spirit world? And therefore, is this going to improve or bring about our own spiritual rebirth in some sense? Or
we can't return to the spirituality of the Native Americans. And one of the great things in James Welch's Fool's Crow is the way in which he shows how the Native American spirituality is undermined from within. And not just through the assault of the white settlers and the military. And that's this disenchantment that everyone has to confront. You can't hope to re-enchant the world so that it looks like the way it's looked across the globe, say 500 years ago. It has to be recovered. It has to be rethought and found again. And there's much to be learned, I think, from Native American spirituality, say. They have had experiences with this country that go back, 10,000 years, say. And they had found a way, at least, the hunting and gathering cultures on this side of the continent, of living lightly, though, by leaving traces, to be sure. But the point is, I think, that this sort of literal going back is a dead end. It's just not possible, and it's a struggle for everyone. When I teach Fool's Crow in an ethics course, and I point out how the Native Americans, and then, there's this wonderful passage where Fool's Crow is shown the future on a deerskin. And Sawatsaki Feather woman asks, "Are you angry now?" And he says, "No, I'm not angry, but I'm worried." And what is he worried about? He's not worried about his own generation. He's worried about the future generation. He sees them doing the same thing that the white people are doing. And that's, so it's the challenge for them to bring their culture into a world that in some ways has to be and will remain, disenchanted. But then I point out to them that we haven't done it either, right? Christians haven't really succeeded either in giving their culture a secure and consequential, influential position. So it's an open task.
We're almost out of time, but is there another table?
oh yeah.
Sure. You mentioned the segment of our society that is ignorant or indifferent to the issue of climate change. And so we were wondering in our group, what are some practical things that a church congregation or any congregation of concerned people for that matter might take to alleviate that indifference?
The first thing, of course, is to make that part of your work as a congregation, and to avoid, I think, what happens all too often with Christians, that we think it's not our. Well, Christianity is usually sort of this sublime level, that floats above everything else, and it's just also wonderful. And but when you leave church, it doesn't really matter. Your life is indistinguishable from the person next door who is an atheist an agnostic or whatever. So it has to be connected in a way that it matters in your daily life. And then the next thing is you have to take political action. If you're unwilling to support politicians who, on balance, are the more socially conscious and the more environmentally conscious, they may not be everything you want, but there's always a choice between, the two candidates in the general election. And if you're unwilling to support the one who will defend and promote social justice and environmental concern more than the other, then I think you're not making the difference that you should be making. And that's hard, I know. And perhaps it's impossible. You don't want to, divide your congregation or, lose half of it by saying, vote for John Tester or whoever.
We need to get rid of the electoral college.
Yeah, definitely, yeah, right. That would be a good step.
We heard from all the tables that want to, Doris?
So do you think that it will take us more to the brink before we will spiritually or morally begin to really, as a society, culture, attack this problem?
Well, there's a thing we may call the blessings of calamity and the burdens of good fortune. And the blessings of calamity is just what you talk about, right? It rouses us. It makes us better people, more cooperative. But then, just as you say, once the crisis dissipates, that all goes away. Good fortune takes over, and relatively good fortune is difficult. A difficult condition to do the right thing, right? It has this anesthetizing narcotic effect. And so we definitely do not want to wait for calamities. And as I said, calamities may not come, right? We may just it's just conceivable that we slide into a sustainable situation at environmental and social cost without a calamity that makes us sit up and say, we got to rethink our situation from the ground up. We've got to be more socially just and more environmentally conscious. So we can't count on calamities. We have to take on the everyday situation and, as I said, work at those various levels, the political and the daily, the religious and spiritual.
Well, we didn't exactly know this when we started it, but I think we found a way for at least some of our faith communities to come together in Missoula and celebrate what we have in common, and we hope to be able to do this again as a way to have a speaker or a lecture, but to also share our own thoughts and ideas. So we're really pleased with this format. We want to thank all of you who've come to this lecture and the others, and to again encourage you to stop by and give us your registrations if you think you're coming. So we'll have tables like this at Holy Family John the 23rd on Saturday morning, and you can then come and find out what to do. We've heard a lot of comments. So what should we do about it? That's what Saturday morning is going to answer. So we hope we've given you some energy. I also want to say that Dane Scott wave your hand, Dane, is here to sign off on anyone who needs a signature that they have attended this lecture for what is otherwise known as university credit. Dane will do that for you since we didn't have a handout. You can take this home if you're not signing up as well, but Dane will sign it. So, thank you.